filthy waitress! How dare you touch me!
I warned you not to come near me again. Boss, say the word. We'll end this right now. Everyone stand down.
The chandelier cast a fractured light across the VIP dining room just as the crystal wine glass shattered. A gasp choked the dead silence. There stood a $15 an hour waitress, hands trembling, towering over the bleeding fiancé of New York's most feared crime boss. And he was watching her every move. The air inside Le Ciel Étoilé, Manhattan's most exclusive French dining room, always smelled faintly of white truffles, aged oak, and old money. For Clara Higgins, it smelled like a trap. Clara was 24, running on 4 hours of sleep and a diet of stale espresso. She balanced a silver tray laden with beluga caviar and perfectly chilled Dom Perignon, keeping her gaze pinned to the Persian rug beneath her sensible, scuffed black shoes. She wasn't supposed to be working the VIP lounge tonight. She was a backroom girl, a filler shift, someone who kept her head down because looking up meant being noticed. And in Clara's world, being noticed by the wrong people was a death sentence. "Clara, get in there!" hissed Richard, the maitre d', grabbing her elbow with a bruising grip. His face was slick with a terrified sweat. Sarah just ran out of the back crying. The Moretti woman threw a scalding espresso at her because it lacked sufficient crema. "You're up." Clara stiffened. "Richard, no. You know I don't work the private rooms." "You do tonight, or you're fired," Richard snapped, shoving the tray higher into her hands. "It's the Rossi table. Do you understand what happens to me if the Rossi table is kept waiting? Go. Pour the wine, serve the appetizers, and become invisible." The name hit Clara like a physical blow to the ribs. Rossi. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 4 years, not since the rainy night in Boston when she was shoved into the back of a Greyhound bus with nothing but a duffel bag and a bruised heart. Taking a shaky breath, Clara pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining suite. The room was vast, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline. The atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, guarded by 4 men in tailored Italian suits who looked less like security and more like executioners. At the center of the room sat a massive circular table, and there he was, Declan Rossi. He sat at the head of the table, shrouded in the shadows of the dim lighting, yet commanding the space like a king presiding over a court of execution. He was older now. The boyish charm that had captivated Clara during their secret summer in Massachusetts was entirely gone, replaced by the hardened, ruthless edge of a man who had inherited a criminal empire forged in violence. His jaw was locked, his dark eyes staring blankly at the cityscape. He wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit that looked like armor. Beside him sat Isabella Moretti. If Declan was the ice, Isabella was the fire, destructive, vain, and entirely out of control. She was the heiress to the Chicago outfit, a woman bred for power and draped in millions of dollars of diamonds. This dinner, Clara knew from the kitchen gossip, was a celebration of their engagement, a strategic merger of the East Coast and Midwest syndicates. Clara's hands trembled, the champagne flutes rattling ever so slightly against the silver tray. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, forcing herself to step forward. "Become invisible," she repeated to herself. "He won't recognize you. You are a ghost." She approached the table from the right, her eyes downcast. "Good evening, caviar service, and your vintage," Clara murmured, her voice stripped of any inflection. She reached over to place the crystal bowl of caviar in the center of the table. As she pulled her arm back, Isabella sneered. "Did they pull you out of an alleyway?" Isabella's voice was like scratching glass. She eyed Clara's slightly frayed uniform cuffs with open disgust. "You smell like cheap soap and desperation." "Declan, darling, look at what this place has resorted to hiring." Declan didn't look up from his glass of scotch. "Leave it, Isabella." His voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent a violent shiver down Clara's spine. It was the same voice that had once whispered promises against her skin in the dark. "I will not leave it," Isabella snapped, slamming her manicured hand on the table. "We are paying $20,000 for a private dinner, and I am being served by a street rat." Clara kept her face perfectly blank. She uncorked the champagne with a soft, practiced sigh, stepping beside Isabella to pour. "Careful," Isabella spat. "If a single drop gets on my Valentino silk, I will have my men take your hands." Clara poured the golden liquid flawlessly, not spilling a fraction of an ounce. She moved around the table to Declan's side. As she leaned in to fill his glass, her wrist brushed against the edge of his sleeve. For the first time all evening, Declan turned his head. His dark, stormy eyes dragged up from the pristine white tablecloth, past the silver tray, and locked dead onto Clara's face. Time stopped. The faint jazz music playing through the hidden speakers seemed to warp and fade. Clara saw the microscopic shift in Declan's expression, the tightening of his jaw, the sudden, sharp dilation of his pupils, the way his hand gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned bone white. He recognized her. Even with her hair dyed dark brown, even behind the tired lines of her face, the ruthless Mafia Boss saw the ghost of the girl he had loved and lost. Clara panicked. She pulled back so fast she nearly dropped the bottle, bowing her head. "Enjoy your meal," she whispered, turning on her heel and fleeing toward the mahogany doors. "Wait!" Declan's voice cracked through the room like a whip. Clara froze, her hand hovering over the brass doorknob. "You," Declan said, his voice dangerously soft, laced with an emotion Clara couldn't decipher. "You will be our exclusive server for the rest of the evening. No one else enters this room. Understood?" Clara swallowed the lump of pure terror in her throat. Without turning around, she gave a single, stiff nod. "Yes, sir." The next hour was an exercise in psychological torture. Every time Clara entered the room with a new course, the suffocating weight of Declan's gaze tracked her. He didn't speak to her. He barely spoke to Isabella. He just watched Clara with a predatory stillness, tracking the sway of her hips, the tremble in her fingers, the way she refused to meet his eyes. Isabella, however, was thriving on the tension, entirely misinterpreting it. She assumed Declan was agitated, and she decided to take her boredom and cruelty out on the helpless server. "The Wagyu is cold," Isabella complained loudly as Clara cleared the plates. "Are you entirely incompetent or just stupid?" "I apologize, ma'am. I will have the chef prepare a new—" "I don't want a new one!" Isabella shrieked, picking up her heavy silver steak knife and tapping it sharply against Clara's knuckles as she reached for the plate. The sharp edge broke the skin. Clara hissed, pulling her hand back as a drop of blood welled up. A heavy, dangerous shift rippled through the room. The bodyguards, standing against the walls, suddenly stood straighter. Declan slowly placed his scotch glass down. "Isabella." It was a warning, vibrating with lethal intent. "What?" Isabella laughed, a high, grating sound. "She needs to learn her place. Look at her, staring at you. You think I don't see it? You little tramp?" Isabella stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. She stepped into Clara's personal space, radiating expensive perfume and pure malice. "Ma'am, please," Clara said quietly, clutching her bleeding hand to her chest. She needed this job. Her brother Leo was $30,000 in debt to a local loan shark. If she lost this income, they would break Leo's legs. "Don't speak to me," Isabella sneered. She reached over to the table and grabbed a piping hot tureen of demi-glace sauce. "You want to look at my fiancé? Let's give him something to look at." With a vicious flick of her wrist, Isabella swung the heavy ceramic bowl directly toward Clara's face. It was pure, primal instinct that took over. 4 years of living in the shadows, of looking over her shoulder, of surviving the streets of New York had stripped away the quiet, compliant girl Clara used to be. Before the scalding liquid could hit her, Clara ducked. She dropped her silver tray with a deafening crash, stepped inside Isabella's guard, and drove her palm upward. She caught Isabella's wrist, twisting it sharply to the side. Isabella shrieked as the tureen slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor and splashing dark sauce over her own designer heels. But Clara didn't stop. Running on a blinding surge of adrenaline and years of repressed rage, she stepped forward, driving her shoulder into Isabella's chest and shoving her backward. Isabella lost her footing, tumbling backward and crashing hard into the side of the heavy oak table. Glasses tipped over, red wine bleeding across the pristine white linen like an open wound. The room erupted. The terrifying metallic clack-clack of firearms echoed through the suite as 4 bodyguards drew their weapons, aiming directly at Clara's head. "Don't move," the lead guard, a hulking man named Dante, barked. His finger was tight on the trigger. Clara stood frozen, her chest heaving, her apron stained, looking down at the mob heiress sprawled on the floor. Isabella was weeping in shock, clutching her bruised wrist. "Kill her!" Isabella screamed, her face twisted in demonic fury. "Shoot her! Right now! Declan, have them kill her!" Clara squeezed her eyes shut. This is it, she thought. This is how it ends. She braced herself for the gunshot. "Stand down." The command was so quiet, yet it hit the room with the force of an explosive. Clara opened her eyes. Declan had risen from his chair. He didn't look at his bodyguards. He didn't look at his weeping fiancée on the floor. He walked slowly around the table, his eyes locked onto Clara. "Declan!" Isabella shrieked, scrambling to her feet, her silk dress ruined. She raised her hand, preparing to strike Clara across the face in retaliation. "I am going to rip your eyes out." As Isabella swung her arm, Declan's hand shot out. He caught Isabella's forearm midair. His grip was so vicious, so unyielding, that Isabella let out a strangled gasp of actual pain. Declan slowly turned his head to look at his fiancée. The expression on his face was devoid of all humanity. It was the face of the devil of New York. "Don't touch her again," Declan whispered. The words were quiet, but they carried a promise of absolute violence. "Declan, what are you doing?" Isabella stammered, all her bravado evaporating under the sheer terror of his stare. "She attacked me! She's just a waitress!" "She," Declan said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, lethal octave as he released Isabella's arm and took a protective step, placing himself directly between Isabella and Clara, "is my wife." The silence that followed was absolute. The bodyguards lowered their weapons a fraction of an inch, exchanging bewildered glances. Isabella's mouth fell open in mute horror. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Wife. 4 years ago, before the Mafia War, before the bloodshed, they had gone to a quiet justice of the peace in a sleepy coastal town. A secret marriage. A promise. Forever. A promise she thought he broke when he took over the syndicate and never came for her. Declan finally turned his back to Isabella, looking down at Clara. His hard eyes softened just a fraction, landing on the small cut on her knuckles. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently taking her trembling hand. "Dante," Declan said, not taking his eyes off Clara. "Yes, boss?" The lead guard answered nervously. "Escort Miss Moretti back to Chicago. The engagement is off. The merger is canceled. If her father has a problem with it, tell him he knows where to find me." "Declan, you can't be serious!" Isabella screamed, hysteria clawing at her throat. "You're starting a war over a filthy waitress?" "Take her out," Declan commanded. "If she speaks another word in this room, remove her tongue." The guards moved instantly, grabbing Isabella by the arms and dragging her out the mahogany doors. Her protest silenced as the heavy doors slammed shut behind them. The sprawling VIP suite was suddenly empty, save for the two of them. The shattered glass lay between them, surrounded by spilled wine and ruined caviar. Declan pulled Clara closer, his thumb gently wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "I've spent 4 years tearing this city apart looking for you," he murmured, his voice cracking with an emotion he had buried for nearly half a decade. "Did you really think I would let you go?" The ride from the restaurant to Declan's private residence was suffocatingly silent. Clara sat rigidly in the back of the armored Mercedes-Maybach S-Class, staring out the tinted windows as the neon blur of Times Square gave way to the quiet, tree-lined wealth of the Upper East Side. She was keenly aware of the space between them on the plush leather seats. It was only 6 inches, but it felt like a canyon carved by 4 years of grief, betrayal, and relentless survival. Declan hadn't let go of her hand since they left the restaurant. His thumb traced the jagged scar on her palm, a souvenir from a shift at a diner in Queens 2 years ago, with a devastating gentleness that made Clara want to scream. "You're quiet," Declan finally said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet hum of the engine. "I'm trying to figure out if I'm a hostage," Clara replied, her voice trembling, but her chin held high. "The last time I saw men in suits like Dante's, they were dragging me out of our apartment in South Boston and throwing me onto a Greyhound bus bound for nowhere. They told me if I ever contacted you again, they would cut my brother into pieces and mail him to me." The temperature in the car seemed to drop 20 degrees. Declan's grip on her hand tightened painfully for a fraction of a second before he consciously forced his fingers to relax. He turned his head, and the glow of passing streetlights illuminated a face twisted in profound, agonizing guilt. "My father," Declan stated. It wasn't a question. "Carmine Rossi," Clara confirmed, tasting the bile of the old memory. "He paid me a visit while you were in Miami securing the ports. He showed me photos of Leo walking to his shift at the auto shop. He showed me the marriage certificate he had bribed the town clerk to steal. He told me that you were a prince of the syndicate, and I was a peasant distraction." Clara swallowed hard, blinking back the furious tears. "He said you agreed with him, that you authorized the payoff." "And you believed him?" Declan asked, his voice cracking, a raw, bleeding edge to his tone that Clara had never heard before. "I was 20 years old, Declan," Clara snapped, ripping her hand from his grasp. "I was an orphan raising a teenage brother. I had nothing." Carmine had a gun on the table and an envelope with $10,000. "He told me if I didn't take the bus to New York and vanish, we were both dead. And then, you never came looking for me. For 4 years, not a single word." The Maybach pulled into the subterranean private garage of a towering glass high-rise overlooking Central Park. The engine cut off, leaving them in heavy silence. Declan turned to fully face her. "Clara, look at me." When she refused, staring stubbornly at her scuffed waitress shoes, he reached out, gently tilting her chin up until her eyes met his. "When I came back from Miami, the apartment was empty. My father told me you took the money and ran. I didn't believe him. I tore Boston apart. I sent men to every state on the eastern seaboard, but Carmine was the Don. He intercepted my search parties. He paid off the private investigators I hired to feed me dead ends." Declan leaned closer, his dark eyes searing into hers. "It wasn't until 6 months ago, when my father finally succumbed to lung cancer and I took over the family, that I found the truth. I found his ledger. I saw the payoff to the bus driver to keep you off the passenger manifest. I have spent the last 180 days dismantling my father's loyalists and tearing this city apart brick by brick to find you." Clara's breath hitched. "You were looking for me?" "You are my wife," Declan whispered fiercely, pulling her into his chest. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in as if she were oxygen and he had been drowning for 4 years. "I never stopped looking. I never stopped loving you." The engagement to Isabella. It was a strategic nightmare orchestrated by the Commission to merge the territories. I only agreed because I thought I had nothing left to lose. I didn't care if I lived or died without you. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, letting the dam break. 4 years of terror, of scraping by, of hiding in the shadows of New York, poured out of her in ragged sobs. She clung to the lapels of his Tom Ford suit, finally feeling safe for the first time since she was 20. "My brother," she gasped suddenly, pulling back, reality crashing down on her. "Declan, Leo is in trouble. He developed a gambling problem after we fled. He owes $30,000 to a bookie in Hell's Kitchen, Jimmy O'Connor. They're going to break his legs tomorrow if I don't pay." Declan's expression instantly shifted from a heartbroken husband to the ruthless boss of the New York syndicate. The warmth in his eyes froze into glacial ice. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, dialing a number. "Polly," Declan said into the receiver, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Jimmy O'Connor in Hell's Kitchen. He holds a $30,000 marker on a kid named Leo Higgins. Wipe the debt. Tell Jimmy if he ever breathes in Leo's direction again, I will personally feed him his own teeth. Then, send a crew to pick Leo up and bring him to the penthouse. Declan hung up, slipping the phone away. He looked back at Clara, the softness returning only for her. Leo is safe. You are safe. No one will ever touch you again. The penthouse was a fortress in the sky, a sprawling duplex of pristine white marble, floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass, and priceless art. But by the next evening, the tranquil, insulated silence of Clara's gilded cage was violently shattered. The fallout from Isabella Moretti's humiliation at the restaurant was swift and catastrophic. Isabella, fueled by a toxic cocktail of public embarrassment, shattered pride, and unhinged jealousy, didn't wait for her father's calculated retaliation. She bypassed the syndicate's rules and went rogue. Clara was standing in the massive chef's kitchen, breathing in the scent of Earl Grey tea, finally feeling a fraction of peace, knowing her brother Leo was safe, sleeping off his exhaustion in a heavily guarded guest suite. Then, the reinforced oak doors of the penthouse burst open with an ear-splitting crash. Dante, the hulking head of security, sprinted into the room, his face pale and smeared with dust, an AR-15 rifle strapped tightly to his chest. "Boss, we have a massive breach!" The lobby is compromised, and building security is completely down. Declan stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair overturned. He pulled a sleek Glock 19 from his holster. "Who is it? The commission?" "No," Dante barked, checking his magazine. "It's a hit squad, Albanian mercenaries, and Isabella Moretti is leading them." Clara's teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. "She's insane!" Declan snarled. He grabbed Clara by the shoulders, his eyes fierce. "Get into the panic room behind the library. Take Leo. Do not come out until I open that door. Do you understand me?" "Declan, no." "Go!" he roared, a terrifying command that echoed through the vast room. Gunfire erupted just as Dante shoved Clara toward the hallway. The steel doors of the private elevator bank were blown off their hinges with a deafening explosion of C4. Thick gray smoke and drywall dust instantly choked the luxurious corridor. The terrifying, rhythmic crack-crack-crack of automatic weapons tore through the penthouse, shredding priceless paintings and shattering the custom crystal chandeliers. Clara sprinted into the guest room, shaking a groggy Leo awake. "Leo, we have to move, now!" She dragged her brother down the hall, slipping into the mahogany-paneled library. Finding the hidden switch behind the first edition books, the heavy steel door of the panic room hissed open. She shoved Leo inside into the dark safety, but as she turned to follow him, a horrific sound stopped her cold. Dante groaned in absolute agony. Clara peeked out from the library doors. The hallway was a terrifying war zone of shattered glass and bullet holes. Dante was pinned behind a destroyed marble pillar, bleeding heavily from a vicious gunshot wound to his thigh. 3 Albanian mercenaries were advancing on him, laying down suppressive fire. Declan was trapped in the main living room, pinned down behind a ruined leather sofa, exchanging fire but hopelessly outnumbered by Isabella's heavily armed squad. And then, walking through the smoke like a vindictive ghost, was Isabella. She wore a tailored black trench coat, clutching a silver revolver, her eyes scanning the wreckage with manic glee. "Where is she, Declan?" Isabella screamed over the gunfire, her voice shrill and demonic. "Where is the little waitress? I'm going to peel her face off!" Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. If she locked herself in the panic room, Dante would bleed out. Declan would be flanked and killed. 4 years of surviving the brutal streets of New York had taught Clara one fundamental rule. Nobody is coming to save you. You have to save yourself. Her eyes darted to the floor near the library entrance. One of Declan's fallen guards lay motionless. Beside his outstretched hand was a dropped Sig Sauer P, 226. Clara didn't think. She simply acted. She dove out of the library, sliding across the polished hardwood floor, her fingers wrapping tightly around the cold steel grip of the gun. She popped up behind the cover of a thick oak credenza, her hands shaking violently, but her grip secure. She had never fired a gun in her life, but she aimed at the closest mercenary, advancing on Dante's blind side, closed her eyes, and pulled the heavy trigger. The recoil bruised her palm, the loud bang deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet missed the mercenary's chest, but struck him squarely in the shoulder. He spun around, dropping his weapon with a howl of pain. The sudden gunfire from the rear caught the hit squad entirely off guard. Dante seized the desperate distraction, leaning out and putting 2 rounds into the chest of the second mercenary. "Clara! Get down!" Declan roared, realizing what she had done. Using the brief window of chaos, Declan vaulted over the ruined sofa. He took down the remaining mercenaries in a matter of seconds, his movements a blur of terrifying, practiced violence. The penthouse suddenly plunged into an eerie, ringing silence, save for the groans of the wounded men. Isabella stood frozen in the center of the room. Her hit squad was decimated. Declan was walking slowly toward her, his gun raised, his eyes devoid of anything resembling mercy. Isabella's hand shook as she raised her silver revolver, aiming it frantically. "Don't take another step," she shrieked, tears of panic streaming down her face. "My father will kill you. He will burn New York to the ground." "Your father respects power," Declan said, his voice a low, lethal purr. He stopped 5 feet from Isabella, his gun aimed directly at her head. "You broke into my home. And worse, you threatened my wife." Declan moved with lightning speed, striking Isabella's wrist with the barrel of his Glock. The silver revolver clattered uselessly to the marble floor. Isabella collapsed to her knees, sobbing in total defeat. "Bind her," Declan commanded Dante. "Tell Don Roberto the price for her life is total control of the Midwest shipping lines." Declan walked over to Clara, gently taking the gun from her rigid fingers and tossing it aside. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck, holding her so tightly it stole her breath. "You didn't stay in the panic room," he murmured against her skin. "I'm tired of hiding, Declan," Clara whispered, wrapping her arms around him, resting her head against his chest. "I'm not a ghost anymore, and I'm not just a waitress." Declan pulled back, his dark eyes filled with absolute reverence. "No," he agreed softly, kissing her deeply. "You are the Queen of New York." Did you expect that explosive twist? Clara went from a struggling waitress to the untouchable queen of the New York syndicate, proving she's no damsel in distress. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Hide in the panic room or grab the gun? Let us know in the comments below. If you loved this mafia romance drama, hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling stories.